You've been lied to, not once, not subtly, but loudly, proudly, and in red, white, and blue. From cherry trees that were never chopped to wars fought for reasons that never existed, American history is less a story and more a well-decorated myth. This isn't about hating your country. It's about finally reading the footnotes. Because the truth? It's not just stranger than fiction. It's been actively replaced by it. 1. George Washington never told a lie. George Washington lied. Not constantly, not clumsily, just enough to help win a revolution, build a government, and keep the myth machine humming. The story about the cherry tree, the one where young George supposedly confessed to chopping it down because he could not tell a lie, was entirely fabricated by a man who made his money writing hagiographies for cash. His name was Mason Locke Weems. His other job? Selling Bibles. So, naturally, he wrote one about Washington. But the real Washington was far more nuanced. His letters are filled with political deflections, strategic omissions, and carefully crafted untruths, including categorical denials of espionage activities during the Revolutionary War, despite having run an elaborate spy ring. He even instructed his agents to burn messages after reading them and regularly deceived the British with fake troop movements. Not exactly the work of a man constitutionally incapable of fibbing. This myth, like most about Washington, wasn't created to preserve history. It was created to domesticate it. To make Washington not a man who survived a meat-grinding winter at Valley Forge and wrestled with the contradictions of owning enslaved people while founding a free country, but a marble statue with teeth made of honesty. Also a lie. They weren't wooden. They were ivory, human, horse, and likely from enslaved people. It's easier to believe in moral perfection when it comes with a powdered wig and a story for children. But that's the trick. These lies aren't about history. They're about needing our history to feel clean. But clean stories don't survive revolutions. Dirty ones do. And George Washington, the actual man, knew that better than anyone. Because if he could lie to win a war, build a spy ring under candlelight, and still be remembered as the guy who never told a lie, well, that's the kind of lie you build a country on. And speaking of people who were somehow always right, always noble, and always wrong, 2. The Founding Fathers were flawless geniuses. Here's the paradox of American hero worship. We canonized a group of men who couldn't agree on whether whiskey should be taxed, yet somehow we treat their every scribble like divine scripture. The Founding Fathers were smart, visionary even. But they were also petty, egotistical, and sometimes absolutely unhinged. Benjamin Franklin gave marriage advice that sounds like it came from a 4chan thread. Alexander Hamilton picked a duel over an insult. John Adams passed actual laws to jail journalists. And Thomas Jefferson, a man who owned hundreds of enslaved people, spent part of his life writing very seriously about lights in the sky and how they might be fireballs from space. Sure, they built a constitutional democracy, but they also practiced phrenology, debated whether white wigs were mandatory, and wrote endless screeds against each other in pseudonymous newspaper columns. The Federalist Papers? Great. The backbiting pamphlets they wrote about each other? Petty theater with Enlightenment vocabulary. Worse, they contradicted themselves constantly. Madison helped draft the Constitution and later criticized it. Jefferson praised the common man, but feared the mob. Franklin once tried to abolish slavery, late in life, after profiting off it for years. The genius of these men wasn't that they were flawless. It's that they created a system that could, in theory, outlast their flaws. But we weren't taught that. We were taught to worship them. Literally, in some cases. Jefferson has a temple. Washington's face is carved into a mountain. But worship turns men into myths, and myths are terrible at governing. Because a real genius doesn't leave behind a Bible. He leaves behind a blueprint, preferably one with lots of eraser marks. And speaking of blueprints that weren't exactly perfect from the start, 3. The U.S. Constitution was perfect from the start. The Constitution begins with "We the people." But the question is, which people? The original document wasn't written for you. Not unless you were white, male, landowning, and preferably a Protestant with connections. In fact, the Constitution, the sacred paper framed behind glass and guarded like nuclear codes, was written with glaring omissions that were still unraveling centuries later. It baked inequality into law. It gave us the Electoral College, a compromise to placate slave states. It allowed for the 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved individuals as 60% of a person for congressional representation, but of course gave them zero rights. It didn't mention women, or indigenous people, or non-landowners. The Bill of Rights? That was an afterthought, stapled on like a terms and conditions box nobody really read. And even those rights were limited in practice. Free speech didn't protect abolitionists. Religious freedom didn't help Catholics or Jews much. The right to bear arms? Ask a black person trying that in the 1800s, or 2025. The so-called perfection of the Constitution wasn't a feature. It was a marketing pitch, a founding myth meant to smother critique with patriotism. But the reality? The document has been amended 27 times. It almost immediately needed a fix, and still does. Ask Puerto Rico. Ask D.C. Ask literally any trans person trying to survive a legislative session. Even the founders themselves didn't worship the Constitution. Jefferson believed it should be rewritten by every generation. Washington warned against blind party loyalty. They knew this thing was flawed. They just hoped we'd keep editing, but instead of revising, we started romanticizing. And once you start romanticizing old rules written by powerful men who feared democracy, you start pretending they ever wanted you to vote in the first place. 4. The founders wanted everyone to vote. The founding fathers wanted everyone to vote. The same way a bouncer at an exclusive club wants everyone to come in. As long as you're white, male, rich, sober, well-dressed, Protestant, and preferably named something like Bartholomew or Ezekiel. The idea that America was born as a democracy for the people, all the people, is a pleasant bedtime story. But in reality, the original voting system was designed with surgical exclusivity. Most states required property ownership. Some required a certain income. Others imposed religious tests. Women couldn't vote. Enslaved people were counted for representation, but couldn't speak for themselves. And Native Americans? They were considered outside the system entirely, not even citizens. Even within the privileged white male class, there was deep fear of too much democracy. James Madison, the guy who literally helped write the Constitution, warned against the tyranny of the majority. Alexander Hamilton once said the people were a great beast. And the Senate? It wasn't even elected by the people until the 20th century. It was handpicked by state legislatures, like a poker game between aristocrats. Why the paranoia? Because the founders were terrified of mob rule. To them, democracy was a tool, not a right. The structure they created was layered with filters: the Electoral College, staggered Senate terms, lifetime judicial appointments, all designed to slow down the passions of the masses. Translation: they didn't trust you, or your neighbors, or anyone without a powdered wig and a land deed. And while some states experimented with broader suffrage in the early years, they often walked it back. Voting rights expanded not because the founders gave them, but because ordinary people, the ones they distrusted, demanded them. Sometimes through lawsuits, sometimes through protests, sometimes through pure stubborn presence at the ballot box. But let's be honest, even today, we're still wrestling with this lie. Voter suppression tactics, gerrymandering, closed polling stations, ID laws, all modern incarnations of an old fear, the fear that the wrong people might get a say. The tools have changed, but the intent remains eerily familiar. So no, the founders didn't want everyone to vote. They wanted the right people to vote. People like them, people who'd protect their property, preserve their institutions, and keep the system humming. But you weren't supposed to notice that. You were supposed to think they handed you power with open arms. Just like you were supposed to believe that a woman with a needle stitched the first stars and stripes. 5. Betsy Ross made the first flag. She didn't, probably. There's no historical record from the time, no mention in newspapers, no official documents, not even a side comment in a dusty diary. The first time anyone claimed that Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag was in 1870, nearly a century after the Revolution, and that claim came from her grandson, William Canby, who told the story during a lecture to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. His source? Family lore. His evidence? Anecdotes. And yet, from this single presentation bloomed one of the most iconic images in American history. A stoic seamstress, bent over a candle-lit table, handcrafting a new nation in red, white, and blue. The truth is, we don't know who designed the first flag. Congress passed the Flag Resolution of 1777, but it didn't name a designer. Several flag makers were active in Philadelphia at the time, including Rebecca Young and Francis Hopkinson, the latter of whom actually did submit a bill to Congress for his design services. They stiffed him. But Betsy's version was cleaner, warmer, easier to teach. She was the perfect folk heroine. Female, patriotic, industrious. The kind of figure you could place neatly into textbooks without having to explain political entanglements or unpaid invoices. And that's the pattern, isn't it? The truth of history is messy, ambiguous, often undocumented. But national myths, they need symbols. They need tidy heroes. And they need stories that can be taught in third-grade classrooms without raising difficult questions. So Betsy Ross became the story, not because it was accurate, but because it was convenient. It's the same reason we imagine the Liberty Bell rang out triumphantly when the Declaration was signed, as if history hits perfect crescendos on cue. It didn't, but it's cute to imagine. 6. The Liberty Bell rang when the Declaration was signed. It didn't. In fact, it couldn't have. The bell was already cracked, and more importantly, nobody rang anything on July 4th, 1776, because nobody knew they were supposed to. The Continental Congress approved the text of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, sure, but it wasn't actually signed that day. Most delegates didn't sign until August, some even months later. The idea of July 4th as a climactic fireworks-worthy moment, pure retroactive theater. As for the Liberty Bell, it wasn't even called that until much later. Back then, it was just the State House bell, used to summon lawmakers to session or announce news. It only became a symbol of freedom in the 1800s, when abolitionists, yes, the original woke mob, adopted it as an emblem of the fight against slavery. That crack? It became symbolic. A broken bell for a broken promise of liberty. So where did the idea come from that it rang for independence? From a short story, a fictional tale published in 1847 by George Lippard, who imagined a dramatic scene of an old bell ringer waiting for the signal to toll freedom across the land. It was patriotic fan fiction, but people loved it. It felt true. And in America, feels true is sometimes all it takes to rewrite memory. That story turned into folklore. That folklore became textbook material, and soon, kids were learning that a bell nobody rang, on a date that wasn't the real signing, cracked from the sheer force of freedom. It's poetic, it's dramatic, it's also completely made up. But don't worry, we're just getting started. Because if you think Americans stopped embellishing our origin story after the bell cracked, wait until you hear about the rock we pretend people landed on. 7. The Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock is a tourist trap with a great marketing team and absolutely no eyewitnesses. The Pilgrims, those black hat-wearing, buckle-shoed icons of American origin, did not land on Plymouth Rock. In fact, not a single document from the Mayflower passengers mentions any rock at all. No journal entries, no ship logs, not even a casual "tripped over a boulder this morning" kind of note. The first known reference to Plymouth Rock being the landing spot came more than 120 years after the Mayflower arrived, from a 94-year-old man named Thomas Faunce. He wasn't there, but his dad was, allegedly. And Faunce claimed, just before his death in 1741, that the rock was sacred landing ground. Naturally, that was enough for the story to take off like a pilgrim on a power trip. Now, if you go to Plymouth, Massachusetts, you'll find the rock enshrined under a columned granite canopy, a monument to a myth. It's been moved, broken, reassembled, carved with the wrong date, and relocated so many times that it's basically historical confetti at this point. The version you can visit today is about 1/3 of its original size. The rest? Chiseled off for souvenirs. But the myth persists because it fits a narrative. Bold settlers stepping onto solid American soil, symbolically claiming the land like it was waiting for them. It's clean, it's cinematic, it avoids all the messy details, like the fact that the Pilgrims didn't even land in Plymouth first. They aimed for Virginia, got blown off course, and ended up anchoring at Cape Cod before wandering into Plymouth much later. And let's not forget, there were people already living there. The Wampanoag tribes had been in the region for thousands of years. They watched the Pilgrims arrive with a mixture of caution, curiosity, and ultimately, regret. But you don't get statues for the people who were already home. You get them for the ones who stumbled in and declared it destiny. The rock, like so many things in American mythology, is a stand-in. It's not about what actually happened. It's about what we wish had happened. A clear beginning. A noble gesture. A footstep frozen in stone. But the truth? The Pilgrims didn't need a rock to land on. They just needed a story that would stick. And few stories stick better than the one where America was founded as a safe haven for the faithful. 8. America was founded for religious freedom. The Puritans wanted religious freedom the way a monopolist wants competition, in theory, and only on paper. We're told that America began as a brave escape from religious persecution, that the Pilgrims, bless their bonneted souls, fled tyranny to worship in peace. What we're not told is that the moment they got the chance, they set up their own theocracy and started persecuting everyone who disagreed with them. The Puritans weren't seeking tolerance. They were seeking control. And their version of freedom was narrow. Freedom to follow their exact doctrines. Stray too far, and you were branded a heretic, a threat, or worse, a Quaker. Dissenters were fined, whipped, imprisoned, or banished, sometimes all four, if they were particularly spicy. Take Anne Hutchinson. She dared to hold Bible study sessions in her home and questioned the male-dominated religious hierarchy. For this, she was put on trial, excommunicated, and banished from the colony. Roger Williams, who suggested that maybe the church and state should be separate, and that Native Americans should be treated like actual humans, was also kicked out. He went on to found Rhode Island, which was kind of the original "you can't fire me, I quit" colony. Religious tolerance did exist in some parts of colonial America, Pennsylvania being a standout under William Penn's leadership. But as a national founding principle, that came much later. The First Amendment wasn't ratified until 1791, and even then many states continued to have official religions for years. What actually united the early settlers wasn't spiritual freedom, it was land, resources, and the opportunity to build a community in their own image. And that image, more often than not, excluded anyone who didn't look, pray, or vote the same. So yes, some people came to escape persecution, but far more came to build systems where they could be in charge, morally, politically, and religiously. The myth of universal tolerance is just that, a myth. A neat inversion of a much grittier reality. The irony is that a nation supposedly founded for freedom had to be dragged, screaming and kicking, into actually practicing it. But when you frame history through a romantic lens, even economic rebellions start looking like noble tax protests. 9. The Boston Tea Party was a protest against taxes. The Boston Tea Party wasn't about taxes, not really. It was about who got to make money and who didn't. The simplified version, the one involving angry colonists in raccoon hats yelling, no taxation without representation, and heroically tossing British tea into the harbor, paints the event as a straightforward protest against tyranny. In reality, it was a far more cynical maneuver tied to trade monopolies, smuggling profits, and economic self-interest. By the 1770s, many American merchants were making serious money smuggling tea, Dutch tea, French tea, pretty much anything that didn't have a British logo stamped on it. The Tea Act of 1773 didn't raise taxes. In fact, it actually lowered the price of British tea. The problem? It gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, which meant local smugglers, traders, and merchants, many of whom were colonial elites, were about to lose their cut. So when colonists dressed up as Mohawk warriors and tossed 342 chests of tea into the harbor, they weren't just protesting British taxes. They were protesting British competition. It was an economic tantrum disguised as patriotic resistance. And let's be real, most of the people who participated weren't poor farmers. They were middle and upper-class merchants who had skin in the economic game. The irony? The destruction of the tea didn't hurt the British all that much. It mostly hurt the working-class dock workers and sailors whose wages depended on unloading cargo. Revolution rarely pays by the hour. The Boston Tea Party was a masterclass in political branding. It took a fight over corporate monopoly and repackaged it as a moral crusade. Sound familiar? The symbolism stuck, and generations later, Americans still use the event as shorthand for righteous rebellion. But the truth? It was more like organized vandalism backed by people protecting their financial interests, not exactly the stuff of unblemished democratic ideals. And speaking of myths repackaged as milestones, let's talk about the famous document we pretend gave us independence. 10. The Declaration of Independence gave us independence. It's right there in the name, right? The Declaration of Independence. The day America stood up, dusted off its breeches, and told the British Empire to take a hike. The 4th of July, fireworks, freedom, bald eagles doing donuts in the sky. Except, no. The Declaration didn't give anyone independence. It just declared the intent. A letter to King George, signed with great flourish and very little immediate consequence. When Thomas Jefferson put quill to parchment in 1776, the colonies were already at war, had been for over a year. Blood had been spilled in Lexington and Concord. The Continental Army existed. The fighting was in full swing. The Declaration was more a branding exercise than an emancipation. It wasn't even addressed to the king directly. It was meant for the world, a sort of PR announcement for potential allies like France and Spain. Hey, we're serious about this whole leaving Britain thing. Want to help us out? Even after it was signed, the British didn't pack up and leave. They fought for 7 more years. 7 years of debt, disease, and desertion before the Treaty of Paris officially recognized American independence in 1783. That's when independence actually happened. July 4th just made for a better holiday, easier to remember, easier to sell, and conveniently detached from the messier realities of war. And even that all men are created equal line? A masterpiece of selective morality. Jefferson wrote it while owning hundreds of enslaved people. Many of the signers did too. The word independence didn't apply to women, indigenous people, or anyone without property. For them, the Declaration wasn't liberation. It was paperwork for someone else's freedom. Still, the document's power lies not in what it accomplished, but in what it promised. It was aspirational fiction that eventually became partially true, after centuries of struggle and reinterpretation. But it's telling that America celebrates the signing, not the winning. Because Americans have always loved the idea of freedom more than the boring work of actually maintaining it. And speaking of rewriting moral complexities into feel-good slogans, let's talk about the war we still pretend wasn't about slavery. 11. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. Every time someone says this, a history textbook quietly bursts into flames. The Civil War was absolutely, unequivocally, demonstrably about slavery. You don't even have to read between the lines. Just read the lines. The Confederate States wrote it down. In their secession documents, They explicitly stated they were leaving the Union because of threats to slavery. Mississippi's declaration said it plainly. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Georgia, South Carolina, Texas. Same story, different stationery. The myth that the war was about states' rights is a post-war invention. The Confederate fan club's greatest hit, but what right were those states fighting for? The right to own human beings, to keep an economic system built on forced labor, to preserve a racial hierarchy that guaranteed white supremacy. That was the cornerstone. And Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens literally called it that in a speech. Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. So where did this myth come from? After the South lost, it needed a rebrand. The lost cause narrative emerged in the late 19th century, a propaganda campaign to recast the Confederacy as noble, tragic, and misunderstood. Suddenly, Confederate generals became gallant heroes. Slavery was downplayed as a secondary issue, and the war was repackaged as a romantic defense of states' sovereignty. It was genius, really. Rewrite history, control the story. And with schoolbooks, monuments, and Hollywood doing the heavy lifting, it worked for decades. Many Americans grew up thinking the Civil War was a gentleman's disagreement over tariffs, not a 4-year bloodbath over bondage. Even today, the denial lingers. In political speeches, classroom debates, and the ever-elastic phrase, heritage, not hate. But the documents don't lie. The Confederacy's founding papers weren't about taxes or trade. They were about slavery. Every single one. Pretending otherwise isn't historical nuance. It's historical amnesia. And yet the myth persists, mostly because people prefer a story where their ancestors were tragic heroes instead of traitors to humanity. But if you think the South's leadership was noble and reluctant, wait until you meet their favorite poster boy. 12. Robert E. Lee was a reluctant hero. Ah, Robert E. Lee, the Marble Man, the Southern gentleman who hated slavery, fought for honor, and did what he had to do. A tragic, conflicted hero in gray. Except once again the myth is more flattering than factual. Lee wasn't reluctant. He was ambitious, loyal to Virginia above all, and firmly committed to the social order that slavery maintained. He inherited enslaved people through his wife's family and managed them harshly. Multiple first-hand accounts describe him ordering brutal punishment for escape attempts. He called slavery a moral and political evil. Yes. But he also said it was a greater evil to the white man than to the black race. Translation: he thought slavery was bad for the enslavers, not necessarily the enslaved. When Virginia seceded, Lee had a choice. He was offered command of the Union Army. He declined, saying he could not raise his hand against his native state. It sounds noble until you realize that his native state had just taken up arms against the government he'd sworn to serve. Loyalty, in Lee's case, ran downstream from convenience. After the war, the legend grew. Lee became a symbol, not just of the Confederacy, but of reconciliation. The North needed to heal. The South needed to save face. And Lee, educated, dignified, defeated, became the perfect vessel for collective amnesia. He was depicted as the good Confederate, the gentleman soldier who fought honorably and surrendered gracefully. Statues sprouted like weeds. School names followed. The mythology cemented. But strip away the marble, and you get a man who fought for a cause that sought to keep millions in bondage. His personal kindness or tactical brilliance doesn't change that moral foundation. You can admire his engineering skills, his leadership, even his stoicism, but not the system he defended. The myth of Robert E. Lee persists because it comforts both sides. It allows the South to cling to dignity and the North to claim magnanimity. Everyone gets to feel morally tidy. But tidy history is dishonest history. Because if Lee was a reluctant hero, then what exactly do you call a rebellion led by men who swore loyalty to the Union, then tried to destroy it when they didn't get their way? Maybe honorable isn't the word. Maybe it's just delusional. 13. The South had more honor. Somewhere between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Gone with the Wind, a strange myth took hold that the South, yes, the Confederate South, had more honor, more dignity, more codes. That it lost the war, yes, but not its moral high ground. This idea, like most historical fan fiction, runs on selective memory and costume drama. The South, we're told, was genteel, chivalrous, committed to honor, duty, family, land. That's why they fought. Not for slavery, of course, but for pride, for culture, for principle. Except let's rewind. The South seceded because it lost an election. Lincoln wasn't on most Southern ballots in 1860, but he still won. And the Southern elites panicked, not because he was going to take their guns, but because they believed he'd challenge the spread of slavery. So they walked. No dialogue, no compromise, just an immediate, coordinated tantrum dressed up as constitutional self-defense. Let's call it what it was: the refusal to accept democratic results. The Confederacy was not a noble rebellion. It was a power grab by an elite class that saw its racial and economic dominance being challenged. The secession was not a reluctant necessity. It was a preemptive strike to preserve the right to enslave. Even their own reasoning doesn't hide this. Confederate leaders weren't vague. They said it outright. Georgia's secession documents railed against the nullification of the fugitive slave law. Mississippi's opened by declaring their economy was built on slavery. South Carolina cited the North's failure to protect the rights of property and slaves. But the honor myth got traction because it was useful. After the war, Southern whites needed a story that made defeat noble. The lost cause narrative stepped in, spinning generals into saints, battles into sacred ground, and plantations into pastel storybooks. The narrative didn't just clean up the past. It erased it. It allowed statues to be built, textbooks to be softened, flags to be rebranded. It helped people pretend that slavery wasn't central, that the Confederacy was about heritage, and that the war was fought with moral clarity on both sides. But honor built on denial isn't honor. It's historical cosplay. The Confederacy's legacy isn't gallant cavalry and tragic duels. It's treason in defense of an economy built on human subjugation. And when you scrub that out, when you sanitize the war and romanticize the rebellion, you don't preserve heritage, you pervert it. Still, some people cling to the idea that America doesn't lose, that even the Confederacy wasn't really a loss, just a what-if. Which brings us to another delusion wrapped in denial, that the U.S. never loses wars. 14. The U.S. never loses wars. To believe this, you'd have to define winning so loosely that it includes stalemates, withdrawals, nation-building disasters, and leaving behind your own equipment. But go ahead, walk into any high school history class or Veterans Day assembly, and someone will say it. America doesn't lose wars. It's baked into the patriotic cake. Red, white, blue, and bulletproof. Except, we do lose wars. Sometimes spectacularly. Let's start with the obvious. Vietnam. The most iconic military quagmire in modern history. Nearly 60,000 American deaths, billions of dollars spent, and a withdrawal that ended in helicopters evacuating U.S. personnel from rooftops. Saigon fell. The North won. That's not a tie. That's not a moral victory. That's an L. Korea? Technically a stalemate, but with the Korean peninsula still divided, and North Korea not exactly a poster child for peace, it's hard to count that as a W. We sent troops, tanks, and aircraft carriers, and walked away with a frozen line of tension that remains today. Afghanistan. 20 years. 2 decades of nation-building, counterinsurgency, drone strikes, and ever-changing goals. And in the end, the Taliban retook the country faster than you can say exit strategy. It wasn't just a withdrawal. It was a reset. Back to square one. And those are just the big ones. You can toss in Bay of Pigs, Somalia, Iraq, Part 2, if you want to open the mission accomplished file. The truth is, America has lost wars. Plenty of them. Sometimes in the field, sometimes in the headlines, always at a cost. So why the myth? Because American identity is deeply tied to military dominance. The belief in our invincibility props up everything, from foreign policy to Hollywood. We need to think we win. It's uncomfortable to imagine we don't. But military power is messy. It's not chess. It's politics, resources, public opinion, insurgency, and patience. And America isn't always good at wars of patience. So instead of admitting defeat, we rebrand. We say we withdrew, that we shifted strategies, that we accomplished what we came to do. It's spin, the kind used by countries that need to feel exceptional. But in a way, it's worse than admitting defeat. Because pretending you always win? That makes it easier to keep starting wars. And when the wars end, when the soldiers return, we like to pretend they're always greeted with open arms, except sometimes they weren't. 15. Soldiers are always welcomed home as heroes. The parade, the applause, the tearful family reunion at the airport. These are the images we like to believe. The soldier returns from war, scarred but noble, welcomed by a grateful nation. But the truth is, it depends on the war. Ask a Vietnam veteran, or better yet, ask one who came home in 1971, when public support had cratered, when protests filled the streets, and when returning troops were more likely to be met with awkward silence than hero worship. They were told not to wear their uniforms in public. They were seen, in some circles, as part of the problem. The government didn't do much better. Veterans faced bureaucratic mazes, denied benefits, and minimal mental health support. PTSD wasn't even officially recognized until 1980. Before that, it was called shell shock, or combat fatigue, terms that dismissed the long-term trauma as something you could sleep off. And yet, we cling to the image of the grateful nation, because it's comforting, because it allows us to support the idea of soldiers without reckoning with the reality of how we treat them. Even today, the support the troops slogan gets thrown around like a moral shield. Slap a ribbon on your car. Salute at the ball game. But when veterans need housing, medical care, or job training, suddenly the budget's tight. The discomfort comes from the contradiction. We romanticize war, but we neglect the warriors. We're quick to cheer at takeoff and hesitant to look at the landing. And the worst part? Some of the soldiers we celebrate now were sent to wars we still argue were necessary at all. Wars justified by stories that don't hold up, like the one that says we had to drop the atomic bomb because it saved lives. 16. The atomic bomb saved millions of lives. The atomic bomb ended the war. That part's true. But the idea that it saved millions of lives, and that no other path was possible, is far more complicated and far more debated than the tidy narrative suggests. We're told that dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the only way to avoid a long, bloody invasion of Japan. That millions of American soldiers and Japanese civilians would have died otherwise. That the bombs, horrific as they were, ultimately saved lives by shocking Japan into surrender. That version became the official story almost immediately after the war. It helped Americans make moral peace with an act that killed tens of thousands instantly and left generations with radiation-related illnesses. It justified the unleashing of a weapon so powerful it could vaporize cities. But like many things in history, the truth lies in what's not said. By mid-1945, Japan was already collapsing. Its navy was decimated. Its cities, over 60 of them, had been bombed with conventional explosives. Food supplies were dwindling. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held territory in Manchuria. Some military historians argue that Japan was actively seeking a way to surrender, just not unconditionally. Several high-ranking U.S. military officials questioned the necessity of the bomb even then. General Dwight Eisenhower said he was against it. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff, believed the bomb had no military justification. The use of this barbarous weapon, he later wrote, was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. These weren't fringe voices. These were the guys running the war. So why drop the bombs? That's still debated. Some historians argue it was meant not just to defeat Japan, but to intimidate the Soviet Union in the opening moves of the Cold War. Others believe it was a demonstration of power, a political message written in mushroom clouds. And let's not forget, the U.S. dropped 2 bombs, one on Hiroshima, another on Nagasaki just 3 days later. The second strike was so rushed that Japan barely had time to process what had happened before the next city was destroyed. If the goal was to give Japan time to surrender, the window was microscopic. None of this means the bombings weren't consequential. They ended the war. They terrified the world. They changed the future of military power forever. But to say they saved lives, definitively, unquestionably, and morally cleanly, is to ignore the fact that even in 1945, people were already questioning whether it was necessary. The myth survives because it's comforting. It tells us that even in our darkest moments, we were still the good guys. It puts the mushroom cloud on a pedestal of mercy. But war doesn't work like that. Mercy and destruction rarely ride the same bomb. And the moment you believe your side never crosses lines, that's when you stop looking for the ones it already has. 17. U.S. troops would never harm civilians. This is one of the most persistent and dangerous illusions in the American mythos. The belief that U.S. troops, unlike the rest of the world's armies, hold themselves to a higher standard. That civilian casualties are rare, accidental, regrettable, and never systemic. But history tells a different story. Start with My Lai, Vietnam, 1968. Over 500 unarmed villagers, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were massacred by a U.S. infantry unit. It was a deliberate, prolonged killing spree. Not an accident, not collateral damage. The cover-up lasted over a year before a whistleblower finally exposed it. Then Abu Ghraib, Iraq, 2004. Photos revealed U.S. soldiers abusing detainees, forcing them into humiliating positions, threatening them with dogs, and worse. It wasn't a rogue incident. It was part of a broader failure in leadership and accountability. Or go further back, to Sand Creek, 1864. A peaceful village of Cheyenne and Arapaho was attacked by U.S. cavalry. Despite flying an American flag as a symbol of alliance, around 150 Native people were killed. Many were women and children. The military command responsible was never truly held accountable. These aren't isolated events. They're patterns. Wartime dehumanization leads to wartime atrocities. And while American soldiers have often shown bravery and discipline, the notion that they never harm civilians is provably false. It's not about attacking the troops. It's about refusing to whitewash history. In Iraq and Afghanistan, drone strikes and raids repeatedly resulted in civilian casualties, sometimes entire families. Each time, investigations were launched, apologies issued, and the phrase, mistaken identity, trotted out. But to the people on the receiving end, the difference between accident and policy failure is irrelevant. This isn't about assigning universal guilt. Many soldiers serve with integrity and compassion. But the myth that we're uniquely moral, uniquely restrained, creates dangerous blind spots. It excuses scrutiny. It prevents reflection. And it allows politicians to send troops into wars with the public barely blinking. It also obscures how war really works. Under pressure, with incomplete information, in environments shaped by fear and confusion. Mistakes happen. So do abuses. Pretending otherwise doesn't honor the troops. It weaponizes their service for national myth-making. True respect means facing the truth, not burying it. And speaking of truth buried under decades of spin, let's talk about the most expensive lie of the 21st century. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. 18. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. This one isn't ancient history. It's barely old enough to vote, and yet it stands as one of the clearest and deadliest modern examples of how a lie, once wrapped in patriotism, can justify anything. In the lead-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration made one thing very clear. Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological agents, maybe even nuclear ambitions. We were told the evidence was overwhelming, that if we waited, the next attack could be another 9/11, or worse. Colin Powell, respected and deliberate, stood before the United Nations and made the case with charts, vials, and solemn certainty. We know, he said. Not we think. Not we suspect. We know. Except we didn't. There were no WMDs. Not in the quantities claimed. Not in the forms described. Not even close. The intelligence was cherry-picked, overhyped, and in some cases, fabricated. The infamous yellowcake uranium letter? A forgery. The claims from informants like Curveball? Unreliable at best, deliberately deceptive at worst. By the time the truth emerged, after thousands of U.S. deaths, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths, and the destabilization of an entire region, the damage was irreversible. No WMDs were found. The invasion had been based on a phantom threat. Yet for years the myth persisted. Maybe they moved them. Maybe they're hidden. Better safe than sorry. The mental gymnastics were endless. Not because the facts weren't clear, but because admitting the truth meant admitting we were wrong. Wrong in a way that cost lives, created a power vacuum, and helped birth extremist groups like ISIS. Even now, some still defend the invasion. Saddam was a bad guy, they say. And sure, he was. But that wasn't the reason we were sold. We weren't told it was a moral war. We were told it was a necessary war. And when you dress up necessity in the costume of fear, people fall in line. The WMD lie wasn't just a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of accountability, and a warning that when a nation decides its righteousness is automatic, the truth becomes negotiable. And if that lie could drag us into war, what else have we gone to war for? Well, according to the next myth, it's always been about freedom. 19. The U.S. only fights wars for freedom. Freedom. It's the word stitched into uniforms, etched onto memorials, and printed across bumper stickers like a sacred national brand. According to popular lore, every U.S. military action is part of an unbroken crusade for liberty. America showing up just in time to free the oppressed, spread democracy, and shine a flashlight into the dark corners of tyranny. And sure, sometimes that narrative overlaps with reality. The U.S. helped liberate Europe from fascism in World War II. That part of the story has weight. But it's also not the whole story, and definitely not the rule. More often, the phrase, "we fight for freedom," is retrofitted after the fact. A moral alibi for wars rooted in economics, ideology, or just plain strategic ambition. Take the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century. The U.S. acquired the Philippines after defeating Spain, and then spent years violently suppressing Filipino independence fighters. People who wanted the exact freedom we claimed to be exporting. Over 200,000 Filipinos died. That wasn't freedom. That was empire. Or consider Central America in the 20th century. U.S. interventions in countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador were less about liberating people and more about crushing leftist movements, many of which were fighting dictatorships propped up by U.S. money. Freedom meant freedom for American business interests. Banana republics didn't create themselves. Then there's the Iraq War, which we just discussed. Once the WMD excuse fell apart, the war was rebranded as a democracy-building mission. But Iraq didn't exactly blossom into a beacon of liberty. Instead, it became a case study in chaos, insurgency, and geopolitical whiplash. Even Afghanistan started as a retaliation effort. Find bin Laden, dismantle al-Qaeda. But as the years dragged on, the mission drifted into vague talk of nation-building, women's rights, and modernization. And when the U.S. finally left in 2021, the Taliban moved back in almost overnight. So what exactly was secured in the name of freedom? The truth is, the U.S. often fights wars for a mixture of reasons: strategic dominance, resource control, Cold War paranoia, domestic politics. Freedom is the branding, the billboard, the thing you say to sell it to the public and yourself. This isn't to say American troops don't believe in the cause. Many do, and many serve with genuine conviction. But the policy decisions that send them into battle aren't always guided by noble intent. They're often shaped by fear, profit, or political calculus. So next time you hear that a war is about defending freedom, ask, whose freedom? Where? At what cost? And why now? Because if every war were truly for freedom, the record wouldn't look so stained. And speaking of stained records, let's look at one of the most dramatic moments in U.S. history. A moment we love to call a total surprise. 20. Pearl Harbor was a total surprise. The attack on Pearl Harbor is seared into the American psyche as the ultimate blindsiding. A peaceful Sunday morning shattered by bombs from the sky, with no warning, no hints, no signs. It's the event that pulled the U.S. into World War II, hardened public opinion overnight, and painted Japan as the treacherous villain in a black-and-white drama. But no one saw it coming isn't entirely true. In fact, there were signs, warnings, intercepted messages, and a growing awareness among U.S. officials that something big was brewing. It wasn't a bolt from the blue. It was a storm that had been rumbling for months. For starters, Japanese-American relations had been deteriorating rapidly. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931, then the rest of China, and by the early 1940s had aligned itself with Nazi Germany. The U.S. had imposed sanctions, frozen Japanese assets, and cut off oil supplies, measures that effectively backed Japan into a strategic corner. Meanwhile, American intelligence had cracked parts of Japan's diplomatic code. MAGIC, the top-secret decoding program, intercepted messages indicating increased Japanese interest in Hawaii and U.S. naval movements. Some reports even suggested that Japanese aircraft carriers were missing from regular routes. Then came the infamous war warning message sent by Washington on November 27, 1941, to Pacific commanders, 9 days before the attack, saying a Japanese strike was imminent. But it didn't specify where. The prevailing assumption was that the Philippines, not Hawaii, would be the target. Even on the morning of December 7th, multiple warning signs were missed. A radar operator detected incoming aircraft and was told to disregard it. A Japanese midget submarine was spotted near the harbor before the bombing began. And intelligence officials had received a 14-part Japanese diplomatic message, a clear break in relations, that reached Washington hours before the attack but wasn't decoded and distributed in time. So was Pearl Harbor a surprise? Yes, for the people living and working there, for the sailors and civilians who had no reason to expect their world would be engulfed in flames before breakfast. But from a higher level, the picture is blurrier. There were warnings. There was tension. There was intelligence, scattered, misread, or ignored. Why the myth, then? Because surprise removes blame. It absolves leadership. It galvanizes a nation. And it simplifies the narrative. A sudden attack justifies total war. A slow buildup? That raises uncomfortable questions. And Americans, as we've seen, prefer clean origin stories, especially when it comes to war. Which brings us neatly to our next national blind spot, the economic fantasy we keep resurrecting no matter how often it fails. 21. Trickle-down economics works. Ah, yes. The idea that if we just let the rich get richer, eventually some of that prosperity will leak out of their Swiss bank accounts and land in your cup holder. Trickle-down economics, sometimes dressed up as supply-side economics or Reaganomics, is the belief that cutting taxes for corporations and wealthy individuals will spur investment, create jobs, and raise wages for everyone else. Like gravity, but for dollars. The theory sounds plausible in a vacuum. Give job creators more money and they'll invest in the economy, right? But in reality, the benefits rarely trickle. They pool at the top. The wealthy buy back stock, invest in assets, and park profits offshore. Meanwhile, wages stagnate, inequality widens, and middle-class households get hollowed out. Reagan championed this approach in the 1980s, slashing top marginal tax rates and cutting corporate taxes. The result? A booming stock market for those who owned stocks. But income inequality surged. The rich got exponentially richer, while working-class wages barely budged in real terms. George W. Bush tried it again in the early 2000s. Tax cuts, deregulation, more promises of growth. What followed? Short-term bubbles, long-term deficits, and eventually the 2008 financial crash, which once again hit the bottom 90% the hardest. Trump's 2017 tax cuts followed the same logic. Corporations got a huge tax break. Executives celebrated with stock buybacks and bonuses for themselves. Workers? Most saw a modest one-time bump, if anything. The overall impact on GDP growth was minimal, and the deficit ballooned. Every time trickle-down reappears, it comes with new branding: pro-business, fiscally responsible, growth-oriented. But the evidence is clear. It doesn't work for most people. It works on them, as a political sales pitch. The idea that helping billionaires will help baristas is as persistent as it is disproven. Meanwhile, infrastructure crumbles, schools struggle, healthcare costs soar. But the wealthy keep cashing in, because the system keeps telling you they're the economy's engine, not its beneficiaries. Trickle-down economics survives not because it delivers results, but because it flatters the powerful. It tells them they're not just getting rich, they're doing you a favor. But don't worry, if your paycheck doesn't go up, it's probably because you're lazy and living off welfare. At least that's the next lie we're supposed to believe. 22. Welfare makes people lazy. There's a stubborn myth in American politics that welfare is a hammock. Soft, indulgent, and permanently tempting. According to this worldview, people who receive government assistance are milking the system, freeloading off taxpayers, and avoiding work because Uncle Sam keeps slipping them checks for doing nothing. But let's run that through reality. Most welfare recipients in the United States are either working, children, elderly, or disabled. That's not opinion. That's census data. Millions of low-income workers receive benefits like SNAP, food stamps, or Medicaid because their jobs don't pay enough to live on. We're not talking about a lifestyle of leisure. We're talking about people cleaning hospital rooms, stocking shelves, delivering food. People who, ironically, are often called essential during national crises, but paid like they're disposable. The idea that government assistance creates laziness assumes a moral defect in poor people that magically disappears at higher tax brackets. We never ask whether corporate subsidies make billionaires lazy. We don't suggest tax breaks for oil companies will lead to sloth. But give a single mom $400 a month for groceries, and suddenly it's the fall of Western civilization. The modern welfare system, what's left of it, is hardly generous. After the 1996 welfare reform law, federal cash assistance was gutted and replaced with temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, a program that's so limited and conditional that in many states it reaches fewer than 1 in 10 poor families. Work requirements, time limits, drug testing, the barriers are high, the benefits small. And the programs that do still exist, like SNAP or housing vouchers, are heavily means-tested. That means the moment someone starts to earn a bit more money, their benefits shrink. In effect, low-income families are penalized for climbing the ladder. It's not a hammock, it's a tightrope. So why does this myth persist? Because it's convenient. If poverty is the fault of the poor, then the system doesn't need to change. If assistance is the problem, not inequality, then tax cuts stay justified and safety nets stay frayed. It's also politically effective. Demonizing welfare allows politicians to posture as fiscally responsible while cutting programs that primarily help people who don't vote in large numbers. And of course, race plays a role. Though most welfare recipients are white, public perception skews heavily toward harmful stereotypes. often pushed by decades of political rhetoric painting black and brown recipients as irresponsible or criminal. That narrative didn't emerge by accident. It was engineered. In truth, welfare doesn't make people lazy. It barely makes ends meet. And for many, it's the difference between surviving and slipping through the cracks. But if welfare isn't the villain, then who's the hero? According to some, it's the man who supposedly ended the Cold War by himself. 23. Reagan won the Cold War single-handedly. If American history were a Hollywood blockbuster, Ronald Reagan would be the lone cowboy riding into town, facing down the Soviet Union with a smirk, a tax cut, and a missile defense system named after Star Wars. Cue swelling music. Roll credits. Freedom wins. That's the legend. But the Cold War wasn't a duel. It was a decades-long geopolitical chess match involving espionage, economics, ideology, proxy wars, and a rotating cast of leaders on both sides. Reagan happened to be standing near the board when the king tipped over. Did he play a role? Absolutely. His military buildup, aggressive rhetoric, remember evil empire, and strategic defense initiative rattled Soviet leadership. He pressured their economy, escalated arms races, and drew clear ideological lines. His administration also negotiated treaties like the INF Agreement, which reduced nuclear stockpiles. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse because of one man's speeches. It collapsed because its economy was crumbling, its bureaucracy was bloated, and its people were disillusioned. Years of stagnation under Brezhnev, followed by the reforms of Gorbachev, including glasnost and perestroika, revealed a system already on the brink. The Berlin Wall didn't fall because of American missiles. It fell because East Germans were done pretending. Reagan's policies didn't exist in a vacuum. Carter had already started the military buildup. Nixon and Kissinger opened relations with China to isolate the Soviets. The CIA had been waging psychological warfare since before Reagan was a governor. The chessboard was decades in the making. And let's not forget the cost. Reagan's aggressive spending ballooned the national debt. His support for anti-communist movements often meant backing brutal regimes. The Contras in Nicaragua, for example, which left lasting scars in the name of ideological purity. The Cold War may have ended, but the blowback from U.S. actions continues to shape global politics. So why does the myth of Reagan the solo savior persist? Because simple stories sell. The image of one man staring down the Iron Curtain is more palatable than trying to understand the slow, messy unraveling of a superpower. It flatters American exceptionalism, rewards partisan loyalty, and gives everyone a tidy ending. But history isn't tidy, and victory rarely has a single author. Speaking of misunderstood victories, let's talk about a government program that saved capitalism, and somehow got branded as the exact opposite. 24. The New Deal was socialist. To hear some pundits tell it, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was America's first socialist president, a government-bloated villain who taxed the hard-working rich to hand out freebies to the lazy masses, all under the banner of the New Deal. But here's the twist. The New Deal didn't destroy capitalism. It saved it. Barely. When Roosevelt took office in 1933, the country was in freefall. Banks were collapsing. Unemployment was over 20%. People were starving. Hoovervilles, makeshift shantytowns, were popping up in city parks. Confidence in capitalism was so low that actual communists were gaining traction in American cities. The New Deal wasn't some Marxist takeover. It was a desperate and strategic effort to stop the system from eating itself alive. FDR and his team launched a barrage of programs: Social Security, unemployment insurance, the FDIC, public works projects, labor protections. These weren't designed to overthrow the market. They were designed to stabilize it. He created jobs through the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. He regulated Wall Street with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He tried to restore trust in banks and create a floor under poverty. Was it expansive government? Absolutely. But it was also pragmatic. It was the fire escape that kept the whole building from collapsing. And make no mistake, big business hated him for it. In fact, some wealthy industrialists plotted an actual coup to overthrow FDR in 1933. A bizarre and poorly executed plan exposed by Marine General Smedley Butler. The business class didn't see him as a socialist. They saw him as a threat to their unchecked control. But over time, the narrative softened. The post-war boom gave the New Deal a kind of retroactive halo. Social Security became untouchable. Labor rights became normalized. Public investment in infrastructure and housing transformed the American landscape. Still, the socialist label keeps resurfacing. Every time someone proposes universal health care, student debt relief, or climate action, critics point to FDR's playbook and shout socialism, as if Roosevelt were Lenin with a Harvard accent. In reality, the New Deal represents something uniquely American. A system that's willing to flirt with reform just long enough to avoid revolution. It's not socialism. It's survival with style. But if we're handing out personhood to ideas, let's move on to one of the weirdest legal fictions in American history. One where literal corporations get treated like human beings. 25. Corporations are people. Once upon a legal loophole, America looked at a multinational conglomerate and said, yeah, that's basically a person. This isn't satire. It's the legal doctrine that corporations have some of the same rights as individuals, including the right to free speech, political spending, and protection under the 14th Amendment. Yes, that 14th Amendment. The one originally intended to secure rights for formerly enslaved people. In one of history's most ironic plot twists, it ended up being weaponized to give corporations the constitutional swagger of an actual human being. It started in the late 19th century, when railroad companies began arguing in court that they deserved equal protection under the law. The Supreme Court case Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad in 1886 is famously cited as the moment it happened, even though the justices never explicitly ruled on corporate personhood in their opinion. Instead, the court reporter, a man named J.C. Bancroft Davis, who used to work for a railroad, wrote in the headnote that the court had accepted corporations as persons under the 14th Amendment. That offhand summary was treated like gospel in later cases. What followed was a century-long expansion of corporate rights. They gained protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, free speech rights, and eventually, thanks to the infamous Citizens United v. FEC decision in 2010, the ability to spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns, not donations. Independent expenditures, totally non-influential political spending that just so happens to flood the airwaves before elections. The logic? Money is speech. Corporations are people. Therefore, money spent by corporations is speech protected by the First Amendment. What could possibly go wrong? Well, you now live in a country where oil companies, pharmaceutical giants, and tech monopolies can essentially pour limitless cash into shaping elections, all while hiding behind the mask of personhood without having to worry about things like jail time or, say, a soul. Let's be clear. Corporations are legal fictions. They exist to shield people from liability and to structure economic activity. Giving them human rights doesn't make them more accountable. It makes them more powerful. It allows them to influence legislation, elections, and regulation, while evading the responsibilities actual people can't ignore. The irony? When actual people ask for rights, like voting access, reproductive autonomy, or health care, the system hesitates. But when a Fortune 500 company wants to fund a super PAC in secret, suddenly the Constitution rises like it's been summoned by a stock ticker. Corporate personhood didn't evolve naturally. It was carved into law, case by case, precedent by precedent, until the system looked around and realized that the most powerful people in the country weren't people at all. But don't worry. In America, it's not who you are. It's what you own. Which brings us to the next national delusion, that we live in a pure meritocracy. 26. The U.S. is a meritocracy. The American dream is built on a single promise. If you work hard and play fair, you'll rise. Talent will be recognized. Effort will be rewarded. Success is just a bootstrapping session away. But when you dig beneath the slogans, the data tells a different story. The United States is not a meritocracy. It's a hierarchy, one where zip code, skin color, family wealth, and access to education shape your future far more than talent ever will. Let's start with economic mobility. Studies show that in many parts of the U.S., particularly the South and Midwest, a child born into poverty has very little chance of climbing into the middle or upper class. Your odds are better in countries like Canada, Denmark, or the UK. That's right. The so-called land of opportunity now ranks behind several European nations in social mobility. Why? Because everything here costs something. Public education is wildly uneven, funded by local property taxes, which means wealthier neighborhoods get better schools. Higher education? Saddled with debt. Internships, often the gateway to professional careers, are frequently unpaid, which locks out anyone who can't afford to work for free. And then there's the job market itself, where who you know often matters more than what you know. Networking, legacy admissions, family connections, all of it silently reinforces privilege. Meanwhile, resumes with ethnic-sounding names receive fewer callbacks. Women face wage gaps. Black and brown workers face hiring bias. And disabled applicants are routinely overlooked. But the myth of meritocracy sticks because it flatters everyone. The winners get to believe they earned it all. The losers are told they just didn't try hard enough. It makes poverty look like personal failure instead of systemic exclusion. It turns injustice into a self-help problem. Even American pop culture reinforces the myth. Reality shows promise, overnight fame. Tech billionaires are cast as geniuses who built empires in their garages. Never mind the seed money, elite education, or connections. Every underdog story ends in triumph. Every bootstrap's tale forgets the boots were designer. And sure, hard work can lead to success, especially if you start on third base. But for millions, the game was rigged from the start. The board isn't level. The dice aren't fair. And the dealer's got his thumb on the scale. Meritocracy makes a great billboard. But billboards aren't blueprints. They're just advertisements. And if you think low-wage jobs are just a teenage rite of passage, wait until you see who's actually stuck behind the register. 27. Minimum wage jobs are for teenagers. You've heard this one before. Minimum wage jobs, fast food, retail, cleaning services, are just temporary gigs for high schoolers to earn gas money and character. That's the story politicians love to trot out when arguing against raising wages. The reality? Most minimum wage workers are adults. Many are in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. A significant number are parents supporting children. This isn't a summer job, it's survival, and it's often full-time. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the majority of people earning minimum wage are not teenagers. In fact, only a small percentage are under 20. The typical minimum wage worker is likely to be female, disproportionately Black or Latino, and working in essential services, the very people we relied on during pandemics, storms, and economic recessions. But when they ask for a raise, suddenly the conversation turns to burger flipping and avocado toast. The myth that these jobs are starter gigs helps justify paying starvation wages. It paints the workers as transients, just passing through on their way to real careers. But for many, especially in rural or economically depressed areas, these jobs are the career, not by choice, but because better options are systematically out of reach. And here's the kicker. Those same low-wage workers often qualify for public assistance, SNAP, Medicaid, housing vouchers, meaning taxpayers are indirectly subsidizing massive corporations that refuse to pay living wages. That's not a free market. That's a rigged one. Meanwhile, the cost of living keeps rising. Rent, groceries, childcare, gas, and the minimum wage? In many places, it hasn't budged in over a decade. The federal minimum of $7.25 has less purchasing power now than it did in the 1960s. When workers demand better, critics scoff. Just get a better job. As if those jobs grow on trees. As if education is free. As if mobility isn't blocked by childcare, transportation, or 3 other part-time gigs. The truth is, the economy depends on people working low-wage jobs, to staff stores, cook food, clean offices, and care for the elderly. They're not slackers. They're structural pillars. They keep the lights on. But as long as we pretend these jobs are just stepping stones, we don't have to fix the broken staircase. And if you think that's unfair, don't worry. The next myth will try to convince you that hard work alone is enough to beat it all. 28. If you just work hard, you'll succeed. This is America's favorite bedtime story. That hard work is the magic key to success. The myth goes like this: wake up early, stay late, never complain, and eventually you'll be rewarded with financial security, social mobility, and maybe even a white picket fence. It's simple, satisfying, and almost completely divorced from how real life works. Yes, hard work matters. But it's not the whole story. Not even half. Because for every bootstrapping success tale, there are thousands of people grinding every day without a safety net, let alone a staircase. The field is not level, and the finish line keeps moving. Take the history of American labor. For generations, farmhands, factory workers, railroad builders, and domestic workers toiled in brutal conditions. Many of them were immigrants, black, indigenous, or poor, often all 3. They worked longer and harder than most CEOs today, and they died young, broke, or both. Their labor built industries, fueled cities, and made fortunes for people whose names ended up on buildings. But their own names were forgotten, or considered sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South, legally free but economically trapped. They worked the land from sunrise to sundown, only to find themselves in debt to the same landowners year after year. Hard work didn't liberate them. It just sustained a rigged system. Fast forward to today, and the illusion persists. People work 2 or 3 jobs and still can't afford rent. Students graduate with tens of thousands in debt, told they must invest in themselves just to qualify for a basic career. Single parents juggle full-time work, childcare, and night classes, all while hearing lectures about self-discipline from politicians who inherited their careers along with their bank accounts. Meanwhile, corporate profits hit record highs, CEO pay skyrockets, and wages for most workers stagnate. The ladder to success still exists, but now it's greased, and the bottom rungs have been sawed off. The myth of merit through labor also ignores the role of luck, timing, and inherited advantage. A trust fund helps. So does a parent who can co-sign your loan, or a zip code with good schools, or just being the right color, gender, or citizenship status at the right moment. Saying hard work equals success sounds empowering. In practice, it often just blames the struggling for their own struggle. If you haven't made it, well, you must not be working hard enough. But when you zoom out, the question becomes, why does this myth persist? Because it's comforting. It makes inequality feel earned. It turns systemic failure into a personal shortcoming. And it gives those at the top the moral cover to stay there, untouched. Still, if you ever start to question this whole arrangement, don't worry. There's a Cold War-era mantra ready to put you back in line. 29. Socialism equals communism equals dictatorship. 3 words used interchangeably like a warning label on a suspicious ideology: socialism, communism, dictatorship. Say them fast enough, and they all start to sound like the same boogeyman. For decades, American politics has leaned on this linguistic sleight of hand, equating any government policy that redistributes wealth or provides public services with authoritarian tyranny. Universal health care? Communism. Tuition-free college? Marxism. Regulating Wall Street? Slippery slope to Stalin. But the conflation is more propaganda than political science. In truth, socialism is a broad economic philosophy that emphasizes social ownership and democratic control of resources. It includes a spectrum, from democratic socialism, think Scandinavia, to more centralized models. Communism, as originally theorized by Karl Marx, envisioned a stateless, classless society. And dictatorship? That's not an economic system at all. It's a form of governance, one that can exist under capitalism, communism, or anything in between. Take countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Often cited as democratic socialist models. They rank high in happiness, education, and healthcare. They have market economies and strong social safety nets. They aren't dictatorships. They're constitutional democracies with taxes that actually fund public goods. Meanwhile, America has long embraced socialist programs when it suits us. Social Security, Medicare, public schools, the GI Bill, libraries, fire departments, and yes, even the military. One of the most taxpayer-funded, centrally controlled institutions on Earth. These aren't fringe experiments. They're pillars of American life. So why the panic? Because during the Cold War, U.S. leaders needed a simple binary: us versus them, freedom versus tyranny, capitalism versus communism. Gray areas didn't fit into televised speeches or classroom films. So the language collapsed. Socialist became communist. Communist became enemy. And the logic stuck. The real fear wasn't public programs. It was redistribution. The idea that wealth and power might shift from the top downward. That threatened the status quo. So anything that hinted at collective action or economic justice was branded un-American. That's why, even today, a push for universal health care is met with cries of Venezuela, as if the only options are Wall Street or bread lines. Never mind the dozens of nations with functioning hybrid systems. The myth turns policy debates into ideological trench warfare. It doesn't matter that the U.S. has poverty, crumbling infrastructure, and millions uninsured. The word socialism still triggers a Pavlovian response, not because people understand it, but because they've been taught to fear it. But here's the irony. The same people who scoff at government doing anything useful are often the first to cheer when it builds roads, delivers the mail, or sends a rover to Mars. 30. Government can't do anything right. Ah, the eternal rallying cry of American cynicism. Government is wasteful, slow, corrupt, and incompetent. If you want something done right, we're told, don't let the government do it. It's a belief so deeply embedded that it's practically bipartisan. One side wants to drown government in a bathtub, the other apologizes for using it. Meanwhile, people drive on public roads, drink water from public pipes, and complain about the DMV on a device built with government-funded research. Let's examine the facts. The U.S. government has done, and continues to do, plenty of things right. The National Park System preserves some of the most breathtaking landscapes on Earth. NASA put a man on the moon. The interstate highway system connects 50 states. The CDC, despite political interference, has helped control global pandemics. Public schools educate over 50 million children. The military, for all its complexity and cost, is among the most advanced institutions in history. Want more? Medicare is consistently rated more efficient than private insurance. The post office delivers to every address in the country, 6 days a week, for less than $1. Even the Internet itself started as a government project, ARPANET, funded by the Department of Defense. Of course, government makes mistakes. It's slow, it's bureaucratic, it has waste. But so do private companies. They just hide it better or rebrand it as innovation. Ever been on hold with a telecom company? Tried to cancel a subscription online? Watched a megabank get bailed out after tanking the economy? The myth that government can't do anything right serves a purpose. It justifies cutting services, slashing budgets, and privatizing public goods. It turns citizens into consumers and public servants into villains. But it ignores the reality that many of the things we take for granted, clean air, safe food, disaster relief, exist because government stepped in. It's not about believing the state is perfect. It's about recognizing that collective action, done well, can solve problems markets can't. You can't shop around during a wildfire. You can't Uber your way out of a hurricane. And you shouldn't have to Kickstarter your insulin. The real issue isn't whether government works. It's whether we're willing to fund it, fix it, and hold it accountable. Because when we let cynicism win, we give up the one tool we all own. And speaking of tools, next up is a set of laws, institutions, and beliefs that claim to be colorblind, but somehow always leave the same people behind. 31. Racism ended in the 60s. If racism had an off switch, apparently someone flipped it right after Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, because a whole lot of people seemed to believe that's when it all ended. Cue credits. Cue racial harmony. Cue the part where America finally became the colorblind utopia it was always meant to be. That's the fantasy. The reality? Racism didn't end in the 60s. It adapted. It shifted. It rebranded. Yes, the civil rights movement achieved major legal victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 targeted discriminatory voting laws. These were historic gains, fought for by ordinary people who faced real threats for demanding basic dignity. But legal changes don't erase centuries of injustice overnight, and they certainly don't dissolve the systems that benefit from inequality. After the 60s, racism didn't disappear. It just found new costumes. Instead of whites-only signs, we got redlining, federal policies and banking practices that denied home loans to black families and funneled wealth into white suburbs. That single practice created a racial wealth gap so wide, it's still echoing through generations. Home ownership, the cornerstone of middle-class wealth, was deliberately closed off to millions. Then came mass incarceration, another costume. After civil rights legislation passed, politicians began shifting to tough-on-crime rhetoric. The war on drugs exploded under Reagan and Nixon before him, criminalizing poverty, addiction, and specifically targeting black communities. Black Americans are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, and more likely to receive longer sentences for the same offenses as white people. Education? Still unequal. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods often receive fewer resources, less funding, and less experienced teachers, thanks to property tax-based systems. Employment? Resumes with ethnic-sounding names are statistically less likely to get interviews. Healthcare? Black women are still more likely to die in childbirth. Housing, policing, environmental racism. Pick a sector. And then there's the social layer, the subtle, plausible deniability kind of racism. The questions about where you're really from. The over-policing of behavior. The assumptions about intellect, aggression, or worthiness. You won't find it in textbooks, but it's there, everywhere. The myth that racism ended in the 60s allows people to absolve themselves. If racism is over, then anything that remains must be someone's personal failure, not systemic, not structural. It transforms real grievances into imagined complaints, and it makes any attempt to address ongoing inequality look like unnecessary disruption. But ignoring racism doesn't make you colorblind, it just makes you blind to history. And speaking of history, let's talk about a legal doctrine that promised equality but delivered something much darker, by design. 32. Segregation was about separate but equal. Separate but equal might be the most legally sanctioned oxymoron in American history. Coined in the Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, the doctrine was used to justify segregation for nearly 60 years. The idea was that public facilities could be racially separated. Different schools, bathrooms, train cars, as long as they were equal in quality. They never were, not even close. In reality, segregation meant white schools got brand new textbooks while black schools used hand-me-downs. White schools had working plumbing. Black schools didn't. White hospitals had advanced equipment. Black hospitals were often clinics with outdated supplies and underpaid staff. Public transport, libraries, parks. The list goes on. In every measurable way, white facilities were better funded, better maintained, and better treated. Separate was the law. Equal was the joke. And the system wasn't passive. It was enforced. Actively. Viciously. If a black person used the wrong entrance, they could be harassed, arrested, or worse. Segregation was a full-body experience, where you ate, slept, walked, sat, prayed. It was a control mechanism, physical and psychological, built to reinforce a racial hierarchy. Even after Brown v. Board of Education overturned separate but equal in 1954, change didn't come easy. States delayed, defied, and resisted integration. Massive resistance campaigns popped up across the South. Some schools closed entirely rather than integrate. It took decades, and federal troops in some cases, just to force compliance with a decision that supposedly ended segregation. But even after formal laws changed, de facto segregation remained. Housing policies, school zoning, white flight, and private academies created new lines that kept communities divided. Today, schools in many U.S. cities are more segregated by race and income than they were 40 years ago. The uniforms changed. The system didn't. The phrase, separate but equal, survives mostly in textbooks and ironic Twitter threads, but its logic lives on in debates over charter schools, policing, resource allocation, and who deserves what. It's a reminder that legality does not equal morality, and that equality promised on paper is meaningless without enforcement in practice. Still think the courts are neutral referees? Let's take a closer look at the institution that declared separate was just fine, and has been rewriting the rules ever since. 33. The Supreme Court is neutral. The Supreme Court wears black robes and speaks in Latin. It sounds like wisdom. It looks like neutrality. But the court has never been an apolitical oracle. It has always been a political institution with enormous power and very human judges. Let's get this out of the way. The idea that the Supreme Court is a neutral referee interpreting the Constitution without bias is a comforting myth. In reality, the court is 9 unelected individuals serving lifetime appointments, selected by political actors, confirmed through partisan processes, and delivering decisions that shape society for generations. Historically, the court has been on the wrong side of justice more often than we like to admit. They upheld slavery, Dred Scott, segregation, Plessy v. Ferguson, and the internment of Japanese Americans, Korematsu v. United States. These weren't fringe decisions. They were majority rulings. At the time, they were legal. That didn't make them right. Even landmark decisions like Brown v. Board or Roe v. Wade were the result of fierce political and cultural battles, not detached legal reasoning. And many of those decisions are still being revisited, reinterpreted, or outright reversed. The court's composition changes with presidents. Conservative justices retire strategically under Republican presidents. Liberal ones hold on until a Democrat takes office. It's political chess. The last few decades have made this even clearer. The blocking of Merrick Garland, the rushed confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, the overturning of decades-long precedents, it all reflects a strategic, calculated use of judicial power. Even the language of the court reflects ideology. Originalism, textualism, living constitution. These are interpretive philosophies, yes, but also political banners. They determine how rights are recognized or denied. They shape rulings on voting rights, reproductive freedom, environmental regulation, corporate power, and more. When the court leans heavily in one direction, its rulings don't just reflect the law, they shape the future. And because justices serve for life, they often outlast the presidents who appointed them and the voters who elected those presidents. That's not neutral. That's legacy power. None of this is to say the court can't produce just or meaningful decisions. It has. But pretending it stands outside politics isn't just naive. It's dangerous. Because it shields one of the most powerful institutions in the country from scrutiny, accountability, and reform. Neutrality sounds noble, but in practice, it often just means silence in the face of injustice. And the next place where silence gets mistaken for fairness? the thin blue line. 34. Police protect everyone equally. The phrase protect and serve is stenciled onto police cruisers across the country. It's a promise, a mission statement, and a branding tool all rolled into one. And for many Americans, especially those in affluent or predominantly white neighborhoods, it might even feel true. Cops show up quickly. They're polite. They solve problems. They wave at kids. But for millions of others, that slogan rings hollow. Not because it's never been true, but because it's never been equally true. Policing in America has never been neutral. It didn't evolve from an abstract need for public safety. It has roots in slave patrols in the South and anti-immigrant street enforcement in the North. From its inception, policing was about maintaining social order, and that often meant keeping marginalized groups in check, not safe. Today, the disparities are well documented. Black Americans are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and subjected to force, often without justification. A 2019 study published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found that police violence is a leading cause of death for young black men. Meanwhile, white individuals engaging in the same behaviors, traffic violations, loitering, even shoplifting, are more likely to be warned or ignored. It's not just about violence. It's about presence. Over-policing in poor and minority neighborhoods creates a climate of surveillance, not safety. It means being watched, followed, questioned, and treated with suspicion for just existing. And it's paired with under-policing in ways that matter. Slow response times to real emergencies, cold cases that remain unsolved, and a lack of trust that prevents victims from even calling for help. The myth of equal protection also hides the role of qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that makes it incredibly difficult to hold police officers accountable for misconduct. Even in clear cases of excessive force, lawsuits are routinely dismissed unless there's a previous case with almost identical facts. The system is rigged to protect the institution, not the individual citizen. And while police departments often tout community policing and diversity hires, those reforms rarely change outcomes without deep structural overhaul. Body cameras can be turned off. Civilian review boards often lack teeth. Implicit bias training sounds good on paper, but struggles to shift deeply ingrained cultural attitudes. The myth persists because it comforts the majority. It reinforces the idea that order is being kept, that society is functioning. But order for whom? And at what cost? True equality in policing would require dismantling decades of unequal enforcement, reimagining public safety, and reckoning with the power dynamics that built the system in the first place. But that kind of honesty is hard to come by, especially when even the so-called wars America fights are designed to target some groups more than others. 35. The war on drugs was about drugs. At face value, the war on drugs sounds like a straightforward moral crusade. Stop the spread of dangerous substances, protect the public, clean up the streets. It was sold with urgency, patriotic fervor, and a strong whiff of fear. Drugs were framed not just as a health issue, but as a national threat, a moral contagion that had to be stamped out. But when you scratch the surface, the war on drugs wasn't really about drugs. It was about control. In a now infamous 1994 interview, John Ehrlichman, a top advisor to President Nixon, admitted the truth. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, we could disrupt those communities. And that's exactly what they did. Drug laws were selectively enforced from the start. Crack cocaine, which devastated poor black neighborhoods, carried sentences 100 times harsher than powder cocaine, which was more common among wealthy white users. Same substance, different penalties. The result? Exploding incarceration rates for black and brown Americans, not because they used more drugs, but because they were targeted more. By the time the 1980s rolled around, President Reagan doubled down with mandatory minimums, just say no campaigns, and expanded policing. The Clinton administration followed with the 1994 crime bill, further militarizing police and building more prisons, all in the name of public safety. Meanwhile, drug use didn't disappear. It shifted. It went suburban. It went private. And when the opioid crisis hit white communities in the 2000s, suddenly the language changed. Drug users weren't criminals anymore. They were patients. They needed treatment, not jail. Funny how the rhetoric softens when the face of the crisis changes. The war on drugs ballooned the prison population, devastated families, and eroded trust in public institutions. It didn't eliminate addiction. It criminalized poverty. It funded militarized raids and no-knock warrants while underfunding rehab centers and mental health services. Even today, marijuana is still illegal at the federal level, even as legal dispensaries operate openly in dozens of states. People are still serving decades-long sentences for offenses that are now legal, as long as you're the right kind of person in the right zip code. The myth that the war on drugs was ever about drugs distracts from the real damage. A decades-long campaign of surveillance, punishment, and systemic discrimination. And that brings us to the natural extension of this lie. The idea that mass incarceration is what keeps us safe. 36. Mass incarceration keeps us safe. The U.S. locks up more people than any other country on earth. Not just per capita, but in sheer numbers. Over 2 million people are currently behind bars. Land of the free, indeed. The justification has always been the same. Public safety. The argument goes like this. Crime goes up. You build more prisons. Fill them. Keep the dangerous people off the streets. And voila, the streets are safe again. But that logic only holds if you don't look too closely. Incarceration has risen dramatically since the 1970s. Not because crime surged, it didn't, long term, but because policy changed. Mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, truth in sentencing statutes, all designed to keep people in prison longer, even for nonviolent offenses. The prison population didn't spike because Americans suddenly became more criminal. It spiked because lawmakers decided punishment was good politics. And who did it hit the hardest? Black and brown communities, already over-policed, underfunded, and politically marginalized. The same communities targeted by the war on drugs, redlining, and economic neglect. In these neighborhoods, incarceration became a generational cycle. Parents in prison, children growing up with stigma, whole communities gutted. But here's the kicker. Mass incarceration doesn't make us safer. Studies show diminishing returns. Locking up people for longer doesn't reduce crime in any meaningful way. In fact, excessive incarceration can destabilize communities and increase the likelihood of future offenses. It creates trauma, removes breadwinners, and replaces social support with surveillance. Meanwhile, the private prison industry and prison labor system thrive. Some prisons are literally for profit, incentivized to keep cells filled. Incarcerated people are paid pennies on the dollar to perform essential labor, from making furniture to fighting wildfires, with few rights and little recourse. And let's not forget the cost. U.S. taxpayers spend tens of billions annually to sustain this system. That's money not going to education, healthcare, or mental health. The very things that prevent crime in the first place. The myth that mass incarceration keeps us safe ignores all of this. It comforts the majority. It gives politicians something to point to. It creates the illusion of control. But safety isn't the absence of bad people. It's the presence of opportunity, stability, and trust. And when you look at who's inside the system and who profits from keeping them there, it becomes clear. This isn't about justice. It's about business. And speaking of geography and justice, next, we unravel the comforting myth that slavery was only a Southern sin. 37. Slavery was only in the South. This one is practically gospel in American classrooms. Slavery was a Southern problem, a relic of cotton plantations, Dixie drawls, and Confederate flags. The North, by contrast, wore the white hat, moral, industrial, abolitionist, and ready to fight for freedom. But that version of history is half a story, and half a story, told often enough, becomes a lie. Yes, slavery was more concentrated in the South. It was foundational to Southern agriculture, economics, and politics. But slavery wasn't confined by the Mason-Dixon line. It was embedded in the national economy, North and South alike. Start with the basics. Northern banks financed slave plantations. Northern insurance companies wrote policies on enslaved people, treating human beings as collateral. Northern textile mills thrived off Southern cotton. The port cities of New York, Boston, and Providence were shipping hubs for the transatlantic slave trade. These weren't just passive connections. They were active, lucrative partnerships. Even in states that had formally abolished slavery, it didn't just vanish. In places like New Jersey and Connecticut, slavery lingered long after abolition laws were passed, thanks to slow rollouts, legal loopholes, and indentured servitude laws that extended de facto bondage. New York didn't fully abolish slavery until 1827. That's over 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. The myth of a morally pure North also erases how many Northern politicians, businessmen, and religious leaders were complicit, if not enthusiastic, about maintaining the status quo. Abolition was always a minority position. For every Harriet Beecher Stowe or Frederick Douglass, there were many more who shrugged at slavery or quietly profited from it. And when enslaved people escaped to the North, freedom wasn't guaranteed. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, championed and enforced in the North, mandated that escaped slaves be returned to their owners and punished anyone who helped them. Federal marshals stormed northern cities to drag people back into bondage, often with local cooperation. Even after emancipation, the North's hands weren't clean. Segregation, redlining, school discrimination, and racial violence were national problems. They didn't stop at the Mason-Dixon line. In fact, some of the most devastating race riots in American history happened in Chicago, Detroit, and Boston, not Atlanta or Birmingham. The South may have worn slavery on its sleeve, but the North stitched it into its pockets. Pretending slavery was a Southern sin lets the rest of the country off the hook. It allows people to ignore how deeply embedded racism and exploitation were, and still are, in the very bones of the nation. And while we're busy turning slavery into a regional relic, we also like to turn Abraham Lincoln into a saint. But even that story's more complicated than we like to admit. 38. Lincoln always wanted to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln is the American moral compass. Honest Abe, the great emancipator. He freed the slaves, preserved the Union, and got a giant stone head on a mountain for his trouble. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Lincoln didn't start out wanting to end slavery. He started out wanting to save the Union. Yes, Lincoln hated slavery. He called it a monstrous injustice. But he also believed, early in his career, that the federal government had no authority to interfere with slavery where it already existed. His original position was to stop its expansion, not to abolish it outright. In fact, in an 1862 letter to Horace Greeley, Lincoln wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." That's not exactly the rallying cry of a fire-breathing abolitionist. He also supported colonization schemes, proposals to relocate freed Black Americans to Africa, Haiti, or Central America. He believed racial integration would be too difficult and preferred the idea of a separate homeland. To modern ears, this sounds bizarre, but at the time it was a common, though deeply flawed, solution, even among anti-slavery politicians. Lincoln's views evolved, yes. He was a politician, and a brilliant one. As the war dragged on, emancipation became both a moral and military necessity. Freeing the slaves undermined the Confederacy's economy and shifted the war's moral center. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, freed enslaved people only in Confederate-held territories. It didn't touch slavery in the loyal border states. It was a calculated move. Legally narrow, but symbolically massive. Later, Lincoln pushed for the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery entirely. That was a real pivot. a transformation not just of strategy, but of principle. And it was costly. He paid with his life. Assassinated days after the war ended, Lincoln grew. That's part of what makes his story compelling. But pretending he always had a clear, radical anti-slavery agenda isn't just misleading. It robs us of the more important lesson, that even great leaders evolve. That morality and pragmatism don't always march in lockstep. Mythologizing Lincoln flattens the past. It turns struggle into destiny. But freedom wasn't inevitable. It was contested, messy, delayed, and incomplete. And speaking of incomplete victories, let's talk about the idea that once women got the vote, equality was solved. 39. Women got equal rights after suffrage. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920. At least white women. It was a landmark moment. A triumph of organizing, protesting, and refusing to stay silent. But the idea that suffrage was the finish line for gender equality? That's another tidy story that skips all the messy pages. First, let's address the obvious. Black women, Native American women, and Asian American women faced legal and logistical barriers to voting for decades after 1920. Discriminatory laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, and citizenship exclusions meant the right to vote was often theoretical. But even for those who could vote, equality stopped at the ballot box. Equal pay? Still not a reality. On average, American women earn about 83 cents to a man's dollar, and it's worse for women of color. The Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, but loopholes, weak enforcement, and cultural norms keep the gap stubbornly open. Reproductive rights? Still under siege. The right to birth control wasn't legally guaranteed for unmarried women until 1972. The right to an abortion was established with Roe v. Wade in 1973, then overturned in 2022. In many states, access to reproductive health care is a legal minefield, disproportionately affecting poor and rural women. Legal protection against harassment? Title VII banned workplace discrimination in 1964. But sexual harassment wasn't widely recognized as a legal issue until the late 1980s. And even now, reporting it can mean career suicide. Domestic violence? Long ignored. Police and courts often dismissed it as a private matter well into the 20th century. Marital rape wasn't criminalized in all 50 states until 1993. Let that sink in. And then there's political representation. Women make up over 50% of the population but still hold only around 28% of congressional seats. In corporate leadership, the numbers are even worse. Suffrage was a door, but behind it were rooms full of locked cabinets, glass ceilings, and hidden tripwires. And women, especially those at the intersection of race, class, and gender identity, are still navigating that maze. The myth that voting fixed everything allows society to ignore ongoing disparities. It turns a chapter into a conclusion. But equality isn't a one-time vote. It's a daily fight. And speaking of fights, let's take a look at a system that claims to be blind, but somehow always seems to see wealth and color just fine. 40. The justice system is fair. The justice system is often described in reverent tones. Blindfolded Lady Justice holding the scales, immune to wealth, status, race, or power. The myth goes that in America, everyone gets a fair shot in court. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Everyone gets their day before an impartial judge and a jury of their peers. But in practice, the justice system is less about fairness and more about access. Let's start with the most obvious divide: money. If you're wealthy, the system works very differently. You can afford top-tier legal representation, post bail, delay proceedings, hire expert witnesses, and negotiate favorable plea deals. If you're poor, your fate often hinges on an overworked public defender juggling dozens of cases with limited time and fewer resources. You may sit in jail for weeks or months awaiting trial simply because you can't afford a few $100s in bail. That's not justice. That's a two-tiered system with velvet ropes and trapdoors. Plea bargaining further distorts fairness. Over 90% of criminal cases never go to trial. Defendants, especially poor ones, are often pressured to plead guilty, even when they're innocent. just to avoid the risk of a harsher sentence. It's a gamble, and the House always wins. This creates a conveyor belt of conviction, not a careful weighing of facts. Then there's race. Study after study shows that Black and Latino defendants receive longer sentences than white defendants for the same crimes. They're more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, charged, and denied parole. Implicit bias exists at every level, from policing to prosecution to sentencing. Even jury selection is rife with discrimination. Prosecutors have historically used peremptory challenges to remove jurors of color, shaping whiter, more conservative juries in diverse communities. Police misconduct, wrongful convictions, prosecutorial overreach. These aren't rare outliers. They're systemic. Organizations like the Innocence Project have exonerated hundreds of people, many of whom spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit. And those are just the ones with DNA evidence, the tip of the iceberg. Meanwhile, white-collar crime, tax fraud, embezzlement, securities violations, is often met with slaps on the wrist or civil penalties. Banks that launder billions get fined. CEOs walk away with bonuses. Compare that to someone caught shoplifting or possessing marijuana in a state that hasn't legalized it. Jail time, criminal records, ruined futures. The system's myth of fairness allows these inequalities to persist. It tells the public that outcomes are deserved, that if someone's in jail, they must be guilty, that if someone goes free, justice was served. But fairness is not the default setting. It's a luxury, rationed out by income and background. Justice isn't blind. She just squints selectively, especially when the defendant can't afford to speak up. And speaking of selective truth, let's unravel the modern myth that's not just wrong, it's deadly. 41. Vaccines cause autism. This one doesn't just bend the truth. It bulldozes it, then rewires the rubble into a conspiracy. The myth that vaccines cause autism originated in 1998, when a British doctor named Andrew Wakefield published a paper in The Lancet linking the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, to autism. The media ran wild with it. Parents panicked. Vaccination rates plummeted. The problem? The study was a fraud. Not flawed, fraudulent. Wakefield had undisclosed financial conflicts of interest, manipulated patient data, and violated ethical standards. His medical license was revoked, and The Lancet fully retracted the study. Subsequent research, massive studies involving hundreds of thousands of children, found no link between vaccines and autism. None. Zero. But the damage was done. Celebrity endorsements, looking at you, Jenny McCarthy, daytime talk shows, and internet forums spread the lie. The anti-vaccine movement gained momentum under the guise of medical freedom and parental choice. Science was reduced to opinion. Fear became contagious, and real people paid the price. Measles, once eradicated in the U.S., made a comeback. Outbreaks popped up in communities with low vaccination rates. Children too young to be vaccinated and immunocompromised people were put at risk, all because of a myth that refuses to die. The autism link persists not because of evidence, but because of fear and misunderstanding. Autism is complex, not fully understood, and often mischaracterized in public discourse. Parents looking for answers, sometimes desperate for explanations, are especially vulnerable to misinformation that offers a why. But vaccines aren't the villain. They're one of the most effective public health tools in human history. Smallpox, polio, diphtheria, tetanus, rubella, controlled or eradicated because of vaccines. Every major medical organization on Earth, the CDC, WHO, AMA, supports vaccine safety. The anti-vaccine myth survives because it taps into deeper narratives: distrust of government, suspicion of big pharma, and a growing resistance to expert authority. And let's be fair, some of that skepticism has roots in real harm: medical racism, corporate profiteering, unethical experiments. But rejecting life-saving science because of one fraudulent study is like refusing to drive because someone once sold a lemon. Vaccines don't cause autism, but refusing vaccines does cause illness, outbreaks, and unnecessary deaths. It's not just a personal choice. It's a public one. And yet, Americans have a long tradition of clinging to false origin stories. Like, for example, the belief that one guy discovered a continent full of people already living there. 42. Columbus discovered America. Let's be clear, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. When Columbus landed in 1492, there were already millions of people living across the Americas. Indigenous civilizations with vast cities, rich cultures, complex languages, trade networks, and spiritual traditions. The Maya, Aztec, Inca, Iroquois, Taino, and hundreds of others weren't just waiting to be found. They were already here, thriving. Columbus, for the record, never even set foot on the North American mainland. He landed in the Caribbean, likely on present-day Bahamas or Hispaniola, and immediately began claiming land for Spain, enslaving locals, and searching for gold. He thought he had reached the East Indies. He never knew what America was. He died believing he had found a shortcut to Asia. So how did he become the discoverer of a place he didn't actually discover? Blame a mix of Eurocentrism, nationalist storytelling, and some very dedicated PR. In the late 19th century, during a period of rising immigration and American self-mythologizing, Columbus was rebranded as a heroic figure. Brave, visionary, divinely inspired. Italian Americans adopted him as a cultural symbol. Schools began teaching the rhyme in 1492, as if it were gospel. The federal government made Columbus Day an official holiday in 1937, a political move to appease Italian American communities facing discrimination. But over time, the holiday evolved into a broader celebration of discovery, conveniently skipping over the violence, exploitation, and cultural destruction that followed. The real legacy of Columbus includes enslavement, forced conversions, disease epidemics, and the beginning of a centuries-long genocide of indigenous peoples. His own contemporaries, including Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest, were horrified by the brutality he and his men inflicted. Calling Columbus the discoverer of America isn't just inaccurate, it's erasure. It whitewashes the rich indigenous history of the Americas and rewrites colonization as a noble adventure. It turns conquest into courage. Today, many communities celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead, not as an act of erasure, but as a correction, a recognition that the land we live on has a history that predates flags, borders, and ships with crosses on their sails. History isn't about glorifying the first European to stumble onto something. It's about honoring the people who were already there, and still are. But America has a long-standing habit of calling itself the greatest, often while standing on broken promises and borrowed myths. And that's where we're headed next. 43. America is the greatest country in the world. It's the kind of phrase politicians shout and sitcom dads say, while slapping the side of a barbecue grill. America is the greatest country in the world. It's not a question, it's a declaration. Confident, defiant, chest-thumping. But greatest is a curious word. It begs a follow-up. By what measure? If we're talking about military spending, sure. The U.S. spends more than the next 10 countries combined. If it were a sport, we'd be undefeated champions, with aircraft carriers instead of trophies. But greatness isn't measured by missile silos. What about healthcare? The U.S. ranks last among developed nations in healthcare outcomes, despite spending the most. Millions remain uninsured or underinsured. Medical bills are the leading cause of bankruptcy. People skip insulin doses to pay rent. That doesn't scream greatest. Education? American students rank middle of the pack in global testing. College is world-class, if you can afford it, but student debt tops $1.7 trillion. We've turned higher education into a luxury car loan. Life expectancy? Falling. U.S. citizens live shorter lives than people in most peer countries. Infant mortality is higher. Chronic illness is more common. Obesity rates lead the world, and not in the celebratory gold medal kind of way. Public infrastructure? Crumbling. Roads, bridges, railways, and water systems suffer from decades of underinvestment. Flint still doesn't have clean water. Entire sections of major cities deal with power grid failures every time the wind sneezes. Wealth inequality? Skyrocketing. The top 1% holds more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Wages have stagnated for decades while CEO pay explodes. The American dream is still for sale, but the sticker price keeps rising. Of course, greatness isn't just about stats. It's also about values. But even there, the narrative strains. Freedom of speech? Sure. But journalists face increasing threats. Voting rights? Yes. But increasingly under siege by gerrymandering and voter suppression. Rule of law? Tell that to communities disproportionately policed and incarcerated. This isn't about hating America. It's about rejecting a fantasy that stunts growth. Declaring greatness without examination isn't patriotism. It's branding. And like all good branding, it sells a feeling, not a fact. Real greatness requires honesty. The ability to self-critique, to evolve, to fix what's broken. America has always had potential. But confusing potential with perfection is how systems decay. And sometimes, clinging to the idea of greatness means excusing the past, even the ugliest parts of it, like slavery, which according to some, wasn't that bad. 44. Slavery wasn't that bad. You'll hear this in quiet corners of conversation, in old plantation tour scripts, or sanded-down history textbooks. That slavery, while regrettable, wasn't that bad. That enslaved people were well treated, that they formed strong communities, or that they were better off than in Africa. This isn't historical analysis. It's historical gaslighting. Slavery in America was a system of legalized human ownership, complete with chains, whips, family separation, forced labor, and total legal power of one person over another's body and life. Enslaved people had no legal rights. They could be sold, beaten, or killed with impunity. Their children were born into bondage. Their labor built the American economy while they were denied literacy, autonomy, and basic humanity. This wasn't incidental abuse. It was foundational policy, codified into law, enforced by institutions, justified by theology and pseudoscience, and protected, for centuries, by the Constitution, until the 13th Amendment, and even then with a prison labor loophole. So where does this revisionist myth come from? It's not new. After the Civil War, the lost cause narrative took hold in the South. Part of that was glorifying Confederate generals. The other part was softening slavery into something paternalistic, a benevolent system where enslaved people were supposedly loyal and content. This fiction was taught in schools, printed in newspapers, and whispered in parlor rooms. And it worked. It still works. You see it in plantation tours that avoid the word enslaved and focus on furniture, in textbooks that describe enslaved Africans as workers or helpers, in films and novels that romanticize the antebellum South as a place of gentility and charm, as long as you don't look too hard behind the kitchen door. But downplaying slavery isn't just historically dishonest. It's dangerous. It warps our moral compass. It diminishes the trauma of generations. It tries to turn cruelty into civility. Slavery wasn't just a labor system. It was a violence machine. Economic, psychological, cultural. Its legacy is everywhere. In wealth gaps, health disparities, mass incarceration, and housing discrimination. To say, it wasn't that bad, is to side with the enslavers. It's to erase the resistance, the suffering, the stolen lives. And it's a lie that keeps the door open for more lies. Lies like the ones coming next. The kind that say science itself is up for debate. 45. The Earth is flat. Let's not spend too long here. But yes, in 2025, there are still Americans who believe the Earth is flat. This isn't a joke. There are websites, there are conferences, there's merch. The modern flat Earth movement isn't just an amusing oddity. It's a case study in how conspiracy thinking works. Start with distrust of institutions, add a few cherry-picked experiments, Mix in a charismatic YouTuber or two, and boom, you've got people rejecting centuries of physics, astronomy, and common sense. The irony is, ancient civilizations already knew the Earth was round. Greek mathematician Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference over 2,000 years ago, using shadows and sticks. Sailors noticed masts disappearing over the horizon. Planets are round. Lunar eclipses curve. GPS satellites wouldn't even function on a flat Earth. But flat earthers don't want evidence. They want certainty. In a chaotic world, radical doubt feels like control. If the Earth is flat, then the government's lying. NASA's lying. Schools are lying. And if they're lying about that, what else are they hiding? It's a slippery slope, and not just into nonsense, but into deeper denialism. Flat Earth belief overlaps with anti-vaccine movements, climate change denial, and even QAnon. It's not about the shape of the planet. It's about rejecting the entire idea of expertise, consensus, and science. Once you stop believing in basic facts, everything becomes optional. Reality becomes modular. You get to build your own, complete with secret truths and imaginary enemies. Flat Earth belief isn't harmless curiosity. It's a warning. Because if we can't agree that we're standing on a sphere spinning through space, how can we agree on anything else? Especially when the next lie on the list literally burns down cell towers. 46. 5G towers cause COVID. This one doesn't even try to make scientific sense. But that didn't stop it from spreading like wildfire, sometimes literally. During the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, a bizarre theory took hold online. That 5G cellular towers were somehow causing or amplifying the virus. The claim mutated rapidly. Some said 5G weakened immune systems. Others insisted it was transmitting the virus itself. And some went full dystopia, claiming 5G was a population control device activated by shadowy elites. Within weeks, this unfounded panic triggered real-world consequences. Cell towers were set on fire in multiple countries, including the U.S. Let's be crystal clear, 5G does not cause COVID-19. COVID is a respiratory virus caused by the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. It spreads through droplets, not data packets. Wireless technology, including 5G, uses non-ionizing radiation, meaning it doesn't have enough energy to damage DNA or alter cells in the way, say, ultraviolet or X-rays can. That's basic physics. So where did the conspiracy come from? Like most disinformation campaigns, it capitalized on fear and uncertainty. In early 2020, the world was desperate for answers, stuck indoors, drowning in anxiety. Meanwhile, 5G infrastructure was rolling out in cities. Coincidence became conspiracy. A few social media posts spiraled into forums, then into fringe media, and finally onto the screens of influencers with millions of followers. Add in general distrust of government, corporations, and telecom giants, and suddenly the idea that invisible waves were causing a global pandemic didn't seem that far-fetched to people already skeptical of science. It fit the narrative they were primed to believe. If something new is happening, it must be causing everything bad. The consequences weren't just vandalism. Emergency services were disrupted. Telecom workers were harassed, and valuable time, attention, and resources were redirected from real public health efforts to damage control for viral nonsense. But this wasn't just about 5G. It was a symptom of something deeper. A world where scientific literacy is collapsing under the weight of viral misinformation. Where conspiracy logic replaces critical thinking. Where people don't trust what's true unless it confirms what they already want to believe. The irony? People were spreading the 5G COVID theory using smartphones and wireless internet, often powered by the same infrastructure they claimed was killing them. There's a tragic pattern here. When reality becomes uncomfortable, misinformation becomes comforting. It gives people a villain, a simple story, and the illusion of control. But like every conspiracy theory, it spreads faster than the truth and sticks longer. And when misinformation meets industrial lobbying and political denialism, it grows into something even more dangerous, especially when the planet itself is on the line. 47. Climate change is a hoax. The science is clear. The planet is warming. Ice sheets are melting. Sea levels are rising. Storms are intensifying. Heat waves are breaking records. Wildfires are spreading across continents. Ecosystems are collapsing. Species are vanishing. And yet, there are still people, in 2025, who call climate change a hoax. Let's start with the receipts. 97% of actively publishing climate scientists agree that climate change is real, accelerating, and primarily driven by human activity, namely the burning of fossil fuels. This isn't new. It's been documented for decades. The physics is simple. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere traps more heat. We've known this since the 1800s. So why the denial? One word: money. In the 1970s and 1980s, fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil conducted internal research into climate science. What did they find? That burning fossil fuels would heat the planet, disrupt weather systems, and raise sea levels. They knew. And what did they do with that information? They buried it. Instead of informing the public, they launched disinformation campaigns. They hired scientists for hire to cast doubt. They funded think tanks and media outlets to question the consensus. They borrowed tactics from the tobacco industry, manufacture doubt, stall regulation, frame the issue as controversial. Delay equals profit. And it worked, for decades. Politicians parroted the industry's lines. The science isn't settled. It's a natural cycle. We don't know enough to act. In the meantime, carbon emissions kept rising, and now we're in a situation where the window for meaningful action is rapidly closing. Climate change isn't a distant threat. It's here. More floods, more droughts, more displacement. Insurance markets are collapsing in coastal states. Agricultural patterns are shifting. Whole regions are becoming unlivable. And the people hit hardest? Not the billionaires in climate-controlled homes. It's the poor, the marginalized, the global south, people who contributed the least but suffer the most. The hoax narrative persists because it's comforting. It tells us we don't have to change, that your SUV isn't the problem, that everything's fine. But denial doesn't stop the floods. It doesn't cool the planet. It doesn't save your grandchildren. What's more, climate denial has morphed. It's no longer, it's not real. It's too expensive to fix. It's not our responsibility. We'll just adapt. The language changes, but the outcome is the same. Delay, distraction, deflection. If the planet were a patient, the fossil fuel lobby would be the quack doctor insisting on waiting until things get really serious, as the house burns down around them. But here's the truth. There's no going back. Only forward. The question isn't whether we act. It's whether we do it with purpose or after. It's too late. And yet, some people still insist we already solved these problems, especially when it comes to race. Just ask anyone who believes the civil rights movement fixed everything. 48. The civil rights movement fixed racism. This is one of America's most convenient myths, that the civil rights movement came, saw, and conquered racism. That once Martin Luther King Jr. marched across a bridge and the Voting Rights Act passed, America finally reached racial equality. It's a comforting story, neat, tidy, and full of triumphant speeches. But it's not the truth. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s achieved monumental legal victories. Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These were seismic shifts in American law. They outlawed segregation. They targeted disenfranchisement. They cracked the legal framework of Jim Crow. But legal change isn't cultural change, and racism doesn't dissolve when ink dries on legislation. After the movement, racism didn't vanish. It evolved. It went from front yard signs to red-lined maps, from segregation laws to tough-on-crime policies, from literacy tests to voter ID laws. The machinery didn't disappear. It just swapped out parts. Mass incarceration skyrocketed. Economic inequality persisted. School segregation rebounded. Police violence continued. In 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, opening the door for a new wave of disenfranchisement. Gerrymandering and voter suppression surged, especially in states with histories of discrimination. And then there's the social and psychological layer. The microaggressions, the coded language, the polite racism of boardrooms and college admissions and apartment rental decisions. The kind that's deniable but deeply felt. The kind that leaves no paper trail but shapes lives all the same. The myth that racism was fixed lets people off the hook. It says, we already did this. It turns any further conversation about inequality into overreaction. It frames movements like Black Lives Matter as unnecessary, or even divisive. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Progress isn't proof of completion. Having a black president didn't end racism. Having diverse TV shows doesn't dismantle systemic injustice. Symbols aren't systems. The civil rights movement wasn't the end of the fight. It was a recalibration, a shift in tactics, not a final victory. And perhaps the most dangerous part of this myth is that it allows America to claim the moral high ground while standing on unlevel ground. Because when you believe the problem is solved, you stop looking for the ways it still shows up. And that belief, that America always makes the right choices, is exactly where we end. With one final lie, the boldest one of all. 49. America doesn't make dumb decisions. It's the final boss of American myths. The belief that sure, we may make mistakes from time to time, but at the end of the day, America always lands on the right side of history, always learns, always grows, always knows better than the rest of the world. The myth goes, we don't make dumb decisions, just misunderstood ones. Let's test that. In 1791, the U.S. government passed a whiskey tax so wildly unpopular that it led to a full-blown armed rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington sent in troops, over booze. In 1830, we passed the Indian Removal Act, which led to the Trail of Tears, a forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans, thousands of whom died along the way. At the time, this was celebrated as manifest destiny. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott v. Sanford that black people weren't citizens and had no rights the government was bound to respect. That wasn't just a bad take. It helped nudge the nation toward civil war. In 1919, we tried to ban alcohol entirely. Prohibition. It didn't end drinking. It created organized crime, bootleggers, corrupt cops, speakeasies, and one of the most spectacular policy backfires in modern history. In the 1940s, we rounded up over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, and put them in internment camps, not for what they'd done, but for who they were. It was mass incarceration based entirely on ethnicity. And yes, the Supreme Court upheld it. In 1954, we overthrew the democratically elected government of Guatemala because it threatened U.S. fruit company profits. In 1953, we did the same in Iran, ousting Prime Minister Mossadegh to protect British oil interests. These smart Cold War decisions helped destabilize entire regions for decades. In 1961, we sent CIA-backed exiles to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. It failed so spectacularly, even Kennedy couldn't spin it. The plan made no strategic sense, unless your strategy was public embarrassment. In the 80s, we funded militant groups in Afghanistan, some of which later morphed into the Taliban. In the 90s, we passed the crime bill that helped balloon mass incarceration. In the 2000s, we invaded Iraq based on false intelligence, destabilized the region, and created a power vacuum that fueled ISIS. In 2008, we bailed out Wall Street, not the homeowners. In 2020, we debated whether a pandemic was real, hoarded toilet paper, and turned masks into political statements. These aren't footnotes. These are headlines. These are decisions that shape the country and the world for the worse. And still, the myth persists that America always has a plan, that there's a reason for everything, that we are guided by some invisible hand of wisdom, rather than the more mundane reality. Fear, greed, politics, ego, and human error. America has made brilliant decisions too. Innovations, breakthroughs, progress. But to believe it doesn't make dumb ones, or worse, learns nothing from them, is to ignore the body of evidence stacked across centuries. We are not unique in our brilliance, and we're definitely not immune to hubris. In the end, maybe the most dangerous American lie isn't any one myth. It's the belief that we don't lie to ourselves at all, and that's the truth, whether we like it or not.